Welcome, everyone, to this launch of the latest Adelphi book from the IISS, Asia's New Geopolitics, Military Power and Regional Order. I'm Jeff Mazo, an associate fellow at IISS, former managing editor of the Institute's bi-monthly journal Survival, and consulting editor on the Adelphi book series, whose editor-in-chief is Dr. Benjamin Rode. I'm pleased to have been involved in this project as the book's editor, especially as this is the first Adelphi book to come out with our new design, intended to evoke the 60-year history of the series, as well as the forward-looking analysis for which the IISS is known. As befits such a broad topic, the book has 5 co-authors representing a wide range of expertise: Professor Brendan Taylor, Dr. Tim Huxley, Dr. Lucy Béraud-Sudreau, Professor C. Roger Mohan, and the late Professor Desmond Ball. The book is being released today. IISS members will be getting their copies soon, and it is available to purchase from the Routledge website and online retailers such as Amazon, where the Kindle version is also available. The authors argue that the intensifying geopolitical rivalries, rising defense spending, and the proliferation of the latest military technology in Asia suggests that the region is set for a prolonged period of strategic contestation. None of the 3 competing visions for the future of Asian order, a US-led free and open Indo-Pacific, a Chinese-centered order, or the ASEAN-inspired Indo-Pacific Outlook, is, in their view, likely to prevail in the short to medium term. In the absence of a new framework, the risk of open conflict is heightened, and along with it, the need for effective mechanisms to maintain peace and stability. There have been at least 2 major geopolitical developments in Asia since the book went to press, both of which exemplify the dynamics informing the long-term trends analyzed by the authors. I refer, of course, to the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan and the recent Australia-UK-US regional security arrangement announced 2 weeks ago. But the COVID-19 pandemic took hold during the final stages of preparing the manuscript, and the resulting changes to the security landscape also exemplify, as well as inform, the long-term geopolitical trajectory. As Asia's leaders seek to rebuild their economies and societies in the wake of COVID-19, the authors argue, they would do well to reflect upon the lessons offered by the pandemic and their applicability in the strategic realm. The societies that have navigated the crisis most effectively have been able to do so by putting in place stringent protective measures. Crisis management mechanisms, and even in the longer term, wider arms control, can be seen as the strategic equivalent of such measures, and as such, they should be pursued with urgency in Asia to reduce the risks of an even greater calamity. We have 5 speakers today, 4 of the book's co-authors, and Dr. Lynn Kwok, Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellow for Asia-Pacific Security at the IISS, who will act as discussant. If you'd like to ask a question of any of the speakers, please do so by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window, as shown on the slide here, and typing your question there. Each of the panelists will speak for 5 to 7 minutes, with Brendan Taylor giving an introduction and overview of the book and touching on Northeast Asia. Tim Huxley and Lucy Béraud-Sudreau will then each speak on Southeast Asia, and Roger Mohan will speak on South Asia and the return of geopolitics. Lynn Kwok will follow up with comments on aspects of the book and remarks presented by the authors. So we'll kick off with Brendan. Professor Brendan Taylor is Professor of Strategic Studies at the Strategic and Defense Studies Center, Australian National University, having been head of the center from 2011 to 2016. He is a specialist on great power strategic relations in the Asia-Pacific, East Asian flashpoints, and Asian security architecture. He is the author or editor of 12 books, including The 4 Flashpoints, How Asia Goes to War, and Dangerous Decade, Taiwan Security and Crisis Management, which is also in the IISS Adelphi series. So Brendan, over to you.
Thanks very much for that kind introduction, Jeff, and thanks to everyone for coming to today's launch. And special thanks to you, Jeff, not only for chairing, but also for your very thoughtful edit of the manuscript. Thanks to the Adelphi series editor, Benjamin Rode, for his support throughout. And a very special thank you to our missing co-author, the late Des Ball, both for his essential contributions to the book and for his friendship and mentorship over many years. Geopolitics, or what the great American strategic thinker Robert Hart once described as the peaceful use of military power, has gradually been returning to Asia for the better part of a decade now. The COVID-19 pandemic has both heightened and hastened its return. As Lynn Kwok, our wonderful discussant for today's launch, presciently wrote in June of last year, COVID-19 is likely to accelerate rather than displace existing geopolitical trends. This is not the end of geopolitics as we know it, Dr. Kwok observed, but a sharpening of its edge. In this new Adelphi book, we argue that the salience of military power is indeed likely to increase in post-pandemic Asia as this region becomes significantly darker, more disconnected, and ultimately a more dangerous place. Three distinct visions are presently vying to replace the weakening US-led security order, which has largely underwritten stability in this part of the world for much of the post-war period. The first, a vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific, seeks to expand and adapt that US-led order to new circumstances. The second is a China-centered model for Asian order that excludes the US. And the third is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN's Indo-Pacific Outlook, which emphasizes cooperation and inclusivity over competition, as well as a central role for ASEAN and ASEAN-led mechanisms such as the East Asia Summit. But none of these visions for order will likely prevail over the short to medium term. Instead, the region looks set to experience a protracted, potentially decades-long period of what we call strategic interregnum. In the absence of a pan-regional order, and given the low probability of one prevailing anytime soon, we adopt a more traditional sub-regional approach by analysing how Asia's new geopolitics are playing out in Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. Our primary focus in the book is on how states in each of these sub-regions are employing military power to defend and advance their long-standing territorial claims. And we assess the collective effects of these efforts. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the answers to these questions vary from sub-region to sub-region. And Tim, Lucy, and Rajamohan will speak to those. Overall, however, our conclusions are quite pessimistic. We find that Asia's geopolitics are becoming increasingly complex, and that as they do, the risk of strategic crises and possibly even armed conflict is rising. This is particularly so in Northeast Asia, where deep historical animosities are being exacerbated by increasingly multidimensional and multi-directional arms racing dynamics, including in the conventional, the nuclear, the missile, and the cyber domains. We've seen but the latest installment of these during the past 24 hours, with North Korea's test of what it claims is a new hypersonic missile. Now, it's safe to say that no one wants a major conflict on the Korean Peninsula, or over Taiwan, or anywhere else in Asia for that matter, given the horrendous social and economic consequences this would entail. At the same time, however, few leaders are willing to accept peace at any price, which is why we're increasingly seeing efforts across the region to maintain stability through measures designed to enhance deterrence. But such power balancing on its own, even when combined with the common sense and self-restraint of politicians and policymakers, will almost certainly be insufficient to ensure peace in Asia. That is why during the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union studiously respected the dividing line between coercion and conflict, and why they put in place measures such as the hotline they established in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis to reduce the risks of dangerous interactions and to improve the prospects for crisis management. And yet precisely when such measures are arguably needed most in Asia, they are either atrophying or they are no longer fit for purpose. North Korea, for example, has walked away from many of the crisis management and avoidance mechanisms that it agreed to during the brief inter-Korean peace process of 2018 and 2019. The military confidence building measures agreed by Beijing and New Delhi during the 1990s were insufficient to prevent violent clashes along the Sino-Indian border last year. And meanwhile, there seems little prospect that the protracted negotiations between Beijing and ASEAN to develop a South China Sea Code of Conduct will produce any meaningful agreement. Against this backdrop, we conclude the book by suggesting that the time is right for a serious reinvigoration and possibly even some reimagining of crisis management and avoidance mechanisms in this part of the world. We suggest that leaders might reflect here upon some of the lessons offered by the pandemic and their potential applicability in the strategic realm. If they could step back in time, many would likely wish that they had acted earlier to contain the pandemic when they had the chance. Further, those societies which have thus far navigated the COVID-19 crisis most successfully have managed to do so by putting in place stringent protective measures, such as mask wearing, rigorous testing and tracing regimes, social distancing regulations, and comprehensive vaccination programs. To the extent that crisis management and avoidance mechanisms can be seen as the strategic equivalent of such measures, we conclude the Adelphi by suggesting that these should now be pursued with the utmost urgency in Asia to reduce the risk of an even greater calamity. On that note, I'll hand over to Tim Huxley, who will introduce the book's Southeast Asian dimensions.
Thanks very much, Brendan, for your introduction to the major themes of the book. I think you summed it up brilliantly. But before going on to speak about Southeast Asia, I'd just like to say how great it is to see so many old friends among the participants. I was just looking through the list, and I noticed Heine, Philip, Frank, Tangha, Antoine, Rick, Jonathan, Ben, Adam, John Blacksland, Jenny, Sam McKinder, Michael and Fabrice. Great that you're all watching and listening in for this. So Brendan, as you've said, while recognizing the growing integration of security challenges and reactions to them across Asia, this Adelphi has organized its analysis by looking in detail at three specific subregions. Lucy Béraud-Soudreau and I wrote jointly the chapter on Southeast Asia. My own contribution to that chapter was mainly concerned with assessing the evolving strategic outlooks of Southeast Asian countries and how those have over time influenced those countries' foreign policies, particularly in the present era of major power competition between China and the United States. And I think it's striking how diverse Southeast Asian states' outlooks and policies have been and continue to be. To say that about Southeast Asia, to say that it is above all a region of diversity on multiple levels, particularly in terms of its constituent countries, sizes, their populations, their ethnic, linguistic and religious makeup, and also in terms of their levels of economic development, their historical experiences, and of course their contemporary political arrangements. And to say that that diversity underlies their often divergent perspectives and policies on regional security, I think is to risk saying something absolutely ordinary, obvious, and quite commonplace. It could also provoke the response, well, given the reality of nation states' essential separateness everywhere, aren't all regions and subregions bound to be diverse? Isn't Europe diverse? Isn't Latin America diverse? The answer to those questions is, well, yes, of course, but the whole point of emphasizing Southeast Asia's diversity in the context of this book is that this diversity has had major implications for the subregion's present day and future security arrangements in the face of growing challenges. In brief, diversity has obstructed Southeast Asian countries from finding a strongly held common outlook and strongly held and asserted common policies on strategic matters of vital importance. And it stopped them from asserting those outlooks and policies through their regional association, ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. The notion of ASEAN centrality has become a mantra for the grouping's role in Asian diplomacy. In an ideal world, particularly from the viewpoint of Southeast Asians and their governments, ASEAN would indeed be central. It would then be able to deal from a position of real strength with those which wish to undermine the autonomy of its members and the autonomy of the sub-region as a whole. But unfortunately, centrality has sometimes seemed to ring rather hollow, despite ASEAN's institutional role in organizing institutions such as the ASEAN Regional Forum, the East Asian Summit, the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus, and of course ASEAN has also formulated its own outlook on the Indo-Pacific, which we talk about in this Adelphi book. I think everyone agrees that ASEAN's role is vital, but I have the sense that few people nowadays really believe that the association is as central as it likes to think it is and as it should be. Southeast Asia's multi-dimensional diversity is a wonderful asset in many ways, but because of ASEAN's inability to find a firm common position on the South China Sea or on Myanmar, to give two prime contemporary examples, the grouping's centrality as a major diplomatic actor is really under challenge. In the contemporary regional environment, where the balance of power is under threat, and in which some Southeast Asian governments now routinely face significant external challenges to their interests, the lack of strong Southeast Asian consensus on key geopolitical issues means that ASEAN's member states are pulled this way and that way. Each individually has to find its own foreign policy and regional security balance, while ASEAN itself is often tied down to what are unfortunately often lowest common denominator positions on important regional security matters. And for this reason, ASEAN may also find that its role as the central institution in managing regional security dialogue and regional security initiatives across the wider region is challenged by others. And some Southeast Asian governments might, in time, even gravitate towards alternatives. Of course, some will say there's no point expecting ASEAN to be something that it cannot be. That's a fair point, perhaps, but ASEAN has expressed aspirations. It has set standards for itself. It has set out an ideal vision for the future of Southeast Asia and the wider region. And to suggest that ASEAN will be stuck indefinitely could also be seen as preemptively capitulating to an unnecessarily bleak future in which Southeast Asia's governments and peoples have relatively little say over their region's security future. ASEAN has got huge potential, but it's presently prevented by the diversity of its member states' outlooks from formulating and asserting an effective regional security role for itself. Realizing ASEAN's potential as a significant politico-security actor would require Southeast Asian leaders to assign greater serious attention to regional and international matters at the same time that most of them face serious domestic policy challenges. There is a temptation to prioritize those domestic matters, which are the main concern of Southeast Asian governments' political constituencies. So a more determined ASEAN consensus on regional security may, in the end, require some sort of major external shock. One thing that this book emphasizes is that in the coming years, there is a significant danger of major security shocks in Asia, whether in relation to Taiwan, the South China Sea, or some other regional flashpoint. Such a shock might fracture the sub-region and force Southeast Asian states to side more openly with one or other major power. But that need not be the case. It was only the calamity of World War II, quickly followed by the emergence of the Soviet threat, that provoked Western European countries into close collaboration. And indeed, it was the Vietnam War and the prospect of communist victory that galvanized ASEAN's original members into forming their association in the first place in 1967. I'll stop there and pass the baton on to Lucy, who will talk about Southeast Asian countries' defense outlooks and military spending trends in the sub-region. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. As you just said, I will continue to stress the point that you made and emphasize the diversity of Southeast Asian states, looking at defense priorities and military spending. So most Southeast Asian states emphasize the importance of continuously modernizing their armed forces. Some observers assume not only that Southeast Asian political and military leaders are intent on building up their country's external defense capabilities, but also that these efforts are responses to perceived threats from China. The reality, though, is that Southeast Asian governments' national defense priorities differ widely, reflecting their diverse national circumstances and threat perceptions. In the chapter that Tim and I co-authored, we distinguished 3 levels of ambition for national military capability in Southeast Asia. So broadly speaking, firstly, you have those countries that have built their armed forces to face potential external threats and have dedicated substantial resources to developing relevant capabilities. So these would be Singapore and Vietnam. The second category or grouping of states are those countries that have traditionally focused more on responding to internal security challenges than external threats, but which, given their changing geopolitical environment and evolving threat perceptions, are in the process of transitioning to a wider vision of defense. So here we were thinking of Indonesia, Malaysia, or the Philippines. And finally, you have a third grouping of countries where, because of a long-standing emphasis on maintaining regime stability or internal security or both, the armed forces remain largely inward-looking. And here we would include Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, and Thailand to some extent. So in practice, of course, defense establishments may operate in a wide variety of roles, but this categorization attempts to reflect the overarching priority of each country's armed forces. And now turning to defense spending, we also see this variety of outlooks for different countries, which is influenced by these defense priorities I just mentioned, but also the different economic capacity of the countries in the sub-region. If you take annual defense spending in 2020, it ranged from Brunei, around $400 million to Singapore, which spent almost $11 billion. And in between those two extremities, you have Vietnam, for instance, whose budget was estimated at $5.7 billion, Indonesia at 8.4, or Thailand at 7 billion. So while compiling accurate estimates of defense spending in the sub-region is far from straightforward, due to limited transparency in some of those countries, nevertheless, we can still say that Southeast Asian states' aggregate military expenditure accounted for around 10% of Asia's total defense spending. Growth in Southeast Asia's defense spending has broadly matched that of the wider region. However, there's one key point which we try to stress in the chapter is that Southeast Asia's defense spending has not overall increased more quickly than the size of the sub-region's economy. So the jump of defense budgets over the past decade has been more due in general to increased prosperity rather than an over-prioritization given to defense. And an indicator of this is looking at defense spending as a share of GDP. If you take this indicator, aggregate Southeast Asian defense spending has actually declined slightly between 2008 and 2020 from 1.5% to 1.4%. So actually the share of national wealth in those countries dedicated to defense has declined over the past 10 to 12 years. If you take Cambodia and Myanmar, where armed forces focus primarily on internal security and regime protection, defense funding allocations as a proportion of GDP are higher than the Southeast Asian average. In Singapore and Vietnam, who have more acute threat perceptions and higher levels of military ambition, defense also absorbs a relatively high proportion of national wealth, higher than those of their neighbors. But for those countries which are moving from an inward to an outward defense focus, so Indonesia, Malaysia, or the Philippines, and where we might have expected higher allocations of defense funding, actually the numbers are below the regional average, Southeast Asia's average. And although Southeast Asia's aggregate defense spending rose in the decade to 2020, this trend was not uniform. So in particular, if you look at the military expenditure of Indonesia or Malaysia, it has actually declined as a proportion of GDP since 2015. So economic constraints do play a role here. And consequently, Indonesia and Malaysia have each found it difficult in paying for some of their military procurements. Resources for investment in military equipment, let alone research and development, in support of domestic innovation and production are limited throughout Southeast Asia. Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Vietnam are each estimated to spend a bit less than $1 billion per year on military procurement. Thailand spends slightly more. And Singapore is the only country in the sub-region which is estimated to spend more than $2 billion on military procurement per year. So the chapter goes into more details about ongoing procurements and how they align with the defense priorities of each country. And of course, I won't go through all the details of the different procurements here. So I will just conclude my remarks by giving you the three takeaways from the chapter on Southeast Asia. The first takeaway is that except in the case of Vietnam, there are no determined efforts to develop capabilities focused clearly on deterring China. Notwithstanding occasional attempts to demonstrate sovereignty militarily, most Southeast Asian states lack the resources for direct military confrontation with China and are likely to avoid it at all costs. Secondly, there is limited evidence of arms racing within Southeast Asia. While some Southeast Asian governments and defense establishments do watch their neighbors' defense policies closely, there is no strong evidence of action-reaction dynamics among the sub-region countries in terms of their efforts to develop their military capabilities. In fact, the evidence suggests that levels of defense spending are strongly influenced simply by the resources available. And the third takeaway from the chapter is that Southeast Asian states' diverse strategic outlooks, widely differing levels of resources for defense, and varying approaches to capability development mean that coordination of defense policies has been so far limited. So with this, I will now leave the floor to Professor C. Rajamohan to discuss South Asia.
Thank you. It's really a delight to be part of this project and this that has produced this book on changing geopolitics of Asia and its impact on the military and the regional developments. What I'll do in the next few minutes is really to focus on three themes, three broad changes that are taking place in the region as a whole. One is the changing structure of the region. When we say Asia, Asia-Pacific, or the Indo-Pacific, there are new conceptions of how this region is going to be viewed as being viewed. Second, I think, is about the changing, the return of geopolitics to the region in a big way. And the third, the changes in the regional institutions and the kind of norms and order that we talk about. So these are the three big changes cutting across, I think, all the three regions. So the first point about this structure, the changes in the structure. Many of my friends in East Asia, Southeast Asia would ask, what has Indian subcontinent got to do with Asia? Because the general sense when people talk about Asia or Asia Pacific, we do not really include South Asia within it. But now this traditional conception of Asia, even IISS is still comfortable with Asia Pacific. They still have not adopted Indo-Pacific. This essentially is based on the presumption that somehow South Asia is different and distinct from the other two regions. But that conception itself, that South Asia is somewhat different from the rest of this part of the world, I would submit is itself new. That if you go back to the Second World War, I mean, you saw it was the Indian Army, the armies of the undivided India, working that actually pushed the Japanese armies out of Burma and took surrender of the Japanese armies in Burma, in Vietnam, and in Indonesia. So what has changed? I mean, the imagination of South Asia is different from the rest of Asia was really the Indian withdrawal from the region. And what we're seeing today is the return of India to this region in a fundamental sense, and how this reorganizes the region. And that's why putting Indo into the Pacific is really about bringing India into the new equations. And I think that is the big change. And that itself, of course, is driven by the fact that China's rise and China's impact on not just on East Asia or Southeast Asia, but on South Asia too, has dramatically altered. So I think it is the interconnections between the regions produced by China's rise and somewhat slower emergence of India is a new factor. And I think when we think about new mental maps for this region, that is the big change we need to talk about. And some of the traditional conflicts in South Asia, for example, between India and Pakistan, have increasingly become a subset of India's conflict with China. And India-China conflict itself is now a part of a wider US-China conflict. And I think these are some of the changes that I try to relate what's happening in South Asia to the rest of the region. And that brings me to the larger question of changing geopolitics in this region. For nearly 3 decades, and I think it was largely assumed that great power harmony of the harmonious relationship between the major powers and globalization were irreversible trends. I would say far more than the pandemic. What has dramatically altered is this notion that there will be reasonable amount of good relations between US and China, given the nature of economic interdependence and the logic of economic cooperation that has emerged over the last 3 decades. But those assumptions are now largely gone. That both in US and China, the logic of globalization is being questioned, and in both the countries today, the sense that the need to stand up to the other has emerged. So therefore, this notion that this region will continue to be one free of great power rivalry or of have significant economic integration, both are now under test. That here, so therefore the challenge for us is that as we look ahead, it's not just that there are divisions over what is the nature of China's role or what should be the nature of the US in this part of the world, but it is far more fundamental. I think it's really these questions are pushing us to look at much more intensive military confrontation, which Brendan and Tim and Lucy have pointed to. But it is that military competition, of course, that is the new dynamic in the region. Here, one thing I think what we need to recognize is that as China's influence across the region grows, that this notion that somehow China's rise would be peaceful, or that China will become a responsible stakeholder in the international system or the regional order, or the imagination that China will be a giant Switzerland, largely interested in counting its money rather than having ambitions of its own. What we've seen is the Chinese have their own conceptions of how to organize the region. And I think that conception has run fundamentally in clash with the interests of Japan or India or other countries, as well as the United States. It is that tension now, I think, that's going to define the nature of the geopolitics in this region. And that brings me to the last question of regional order and institutions. Here again, I think the tension between US and China, I think, poses two important questions. And I think one, as China's military power grows, can the US sustain its forward military presence in Western Pacific that it has dominated for nearly 70 years since the end of the Second World War? I think it's reasonable to assume that the US will find it hard to do what it has done for the last 70 years in the face of the emergence of a very superior military force in the Western Pacific. Therefore, that question of the nature of the relationship between Chinese military power and the American forward military presence, and that will be a principal determinant of how the region's geopolitics will emerge. The second, this changing military balance between US and China means that the nature of the alliances too will change, because the credibility of the US alliances were premised on the assumption that the US will enjoy unprecedented superiority over other powers. And that is under challenge today from China's rise. Therefore, I think where this is taking us is really the alliances are under pressure. Some are being strengthened, some are weakening, some countries are de-aligning, some countries are realigning. And India, for example, traditionally non-aligned, today talks about a coalition with the United States. So therefore, the shibboleths of the past, how the existing alliances will hold up in the current situation can't be taken for granted. And I think monitoring those changes will be the key. The second, I think the multilateral institutions that were created around ASEAN, those, of course, have become hard to sustain amidst the new rivalry between US and China. And whether one likes it or not, new institutions are being created. Whether it is the Quad, that is US, India, Japan, and Australia, whether it is the latest AUKUS with US, UK, and Australia, that the recognition that the old institutions are not going to work. While everybody pays lip sympathy to ASEAN-centered multilateralism, that people are making their own arrangements. And I think these now are not going to disappear. So therefore, we're going to have a restructuring of the old US alliance system, as well as the reorganization of the institutional structure, which is beginning to unfold. And then on top of it, we have the Europeans, ones who ran this part of the world. Their flotillas are coming back. We don't know how serious they are, but the fact is that Asia is not going to be a matter of just Asians, and it is not just the US alone from the West that's going to be here. The Europeans are going to show up in some form or the other. And finally, the rules. The assumption that there are certain rules by which you can construct confidence building, that you can de-escalate conflict, those itself are fundamentally changing. For example, can Korean nuclear issue be dealt with purely from a non-proliferation framework? Or you need a political settlement with North Korea? In Southeast Asia, can South China Sea be done within the framework of developing a code of conduct? Or are there going to be new bargains that have to be made? And I think these are the issues that are going to be with us, given the three changes in the structure of the region, in the geopolitics of the region, and the breakdown of the old institutions and the rise of new institutions. These three together are going to shape our region, and dealing with that is going to be not a dull moment in the coming years. And I'm sure the ISS will have its hands fully tied in dealing with this extraordinary change that is unfolding in this region. I'll stop here and hand it over to Lynn. Yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone. Well, I'm truly delighted to be here for today's launch. It was a great honor to be asked to act as discussant. I think it's always a celebration when respected colleagues and friends publish a book, but when four of them do so jointly, it's hard not to be a little over the moon. So congratulations, Lucy, Raja, Brendan, and Tim. I'm really happy for you. I'm sorry I never had a chance to meet Professor Desmond Ball. Asia's New Geopolitics is an excellent read. You will see in the audience that I have marked it up or flagged it up very heavily. There was just so much in there that was interesting and new. So I would commend it to everyone. It's a comprehensive overview of the unique and shared dynamics and circumstances facing Northeast, Southeast, and South Asia, as well as their defense priorities and spending. I think the book's focus on the role played by military power in the region's evolving dynamics helps to plug an important gap that the authors identify, namely the tendency to underestimate the importance of the role played by military power in the region's evolving dynamics. So I'm going to be offering up 3 observations, 3 points by way of observation. First, if, as the authors suggest, intensifying geopolitical rivalries, rising defense spending, and the proliferation of the latest military technology across sub-regions suggests that the region is set up for a prolonged period of strategic contestation, a case may be made then that other factors, in particular economic factors, might be more decisive in shaping the region's geopolitical landscape. I think the book notes how, particularly in respect of Southeast Asia, economic ties with China have been influential in shaping the sub-region's response to China and the attractiveness of competing visions. The question, of course, then becomes how well the United States, as well as its allies and partners, are faring in the economic game. I would say that the US economic engagement with the region is arguably its weakest link. According to a poll conducted earlier this year by the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies, this was a poll of elites, 76.3% of respondents consider China to be the most influential economic power, as compared to just 7.4% choosing the United States. Now, if in my conversations with the broader populace, their surprise was really that the gap wasn't even greater. So, amongst elites, certainly a notion that the economic wins are behind China. Amongst the broader populace, this sense of China's economic strength is even greater. It's unlikely, in my view, that the West's counter to China's ambitious Belt and Road Initiative, the Build Back Better World, which focuses on climate, health, digital technology, and gender equity and equality, will be a complete or even an adequate response to China's BRI. There remains a need in the region for hard infrastructure projects. Moreover, it's far from clear that private sector capital can be persuaded to step up even for the areas identified. We saw that in 2018, the US, Japan, and Australia formed the Trilateral Partnership for Infrastructure Investment, which also sought to support the deployment of private sector investment to deliver on infrastructure and development projects in the Indo-Pacific. But there's been little notable movement on that front. I think returning to the CPTPP will arguably be the best way of the US staying in the economic game, but of course, US domestic politics constrains this path. The second observation I would make is that the authors identify 3 competing visions: a US-led free and open Indo-Pacific, a China-centered model based around Beijing's BRI, and ASEAN's Indo-Pacific, which I quote, emphasizes leadership through the 10-member ASEAN. But it's not clear, however, that this more moderate ASEAN outlook is a serious contender at all. Tim highlighted some of the problems that ASEAN faces. And in my view, too, ASEAN has demonstrated little by way of leadership on issues that destabilize the region. Of course, the South China Sea and Myanmar are the most notable. Tim has already mentioned this. And I think its inability to successfully manage problems in its backyard hurts its claims to centrality. ASEAN has also been reactive rather than proactive in seeking to shape developments in the region. It took a year and a half or more than a year and a half before it had a response to the US free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, before it came up with its ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. And initially its hope was that momentum on the US Indo-Pacific strategy would fade away for lack of momentum. So, it's very much in a reactionary rather than a proactive mode. On the defense front, as Lucy notes, apart from Vietnam, there's been no determined effort to develop capabilities which focus clearly on deterring China, despite the threat that China poses to Southeast Asia's interests, particularly in the South China Sea, and Southeast Asian states' coordination of defense policies has been limited. I think the latest AUKUS deal is only the latest example, and probably not the only one, of the development of minilaterals that overlook ASEAN-centered architecture, despite lip service being paid to it. So I think ASEAN and the centrality of the region as a whole is largely going to see further blows. In my view, it's the question is not whether ASEAN or Southeast Asia will be able to lead on this front, but whether it will be able to successfully stave off the narrowing of its strategic options. As the authors recognize, even if Southeast Asia were able to successfully pursue multi-directional foreign policies, Beijing's role in the sub-region is likely to grow. And finally, my last observation here is that if we are realistically only left with two competing visions for the region, the US-led and the Chinese-led one, and if China is gaining influence through its economic offerings, this is worrying. The authors highlight three broad strategic trends that underline concerns about a darker strategic future, and I quote there, a darker strategic future in Asia, declining US willingness to underwrite Asia's security order, rising US tensions, and weakening Asian multilateralism. But I think China's unlawful and coercive behavior, not least in the South China Sea, needs also to be underscored. This has been a problem in the region for now close to a decade or over a decade, and we have to be very careful about subsuming bad behavior which undermines a rules-based order and that is patently coercive under broad talk of US-China tensions. In the same way, ASEAN and its member states should stop shying away from highlighting concerns about bad behavior by talk of not wanting to choose between the US and China. Being more explicit about calling out transgressions will allow for a more complete and accurate picture of the strategic landscape, and will also help counter narratives that will suggest that all will be well, if not for outsider or Western influence. It's very important, in my view, for Southeast Asia to stop framing the choice as an impossible one between the US and China, but a very necessary one between a rules-based order that offers the region strategic options and a completely lawless one that undermines or denies it strategic autonomy. So I'll just stop there. I'll end by once again congratulating the authors on their excellent book. I look forward to the discussions to follow.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you all for your comments. We have a number of questions in the queue, but before we get to them, I wonder if any of the other speakers would like to respond to anything that Lynn raised. Okay, I guess not. So we've got one question. This is from William Tao. Given the speed of technological change in weapon systems and the cost of applying such change to military strategy and capabilities, are the traditional assumptions of how deterrence or extended deterrence works in the Indo-Pacific now largely outdated? If so, what implications does this have for regional stability and conflict avoidance?
If I might step in there, I think the latest decision by the US to supply nuclear submarines to Australia, nuclear-powered submarines, we must be clear, that itself is a recognition that the traditional forms in which the extended deterrence works, those are under stress. So I think that's a reality, and the countries are beginning to respond to that. Now, what it does to stability and instability is a second question. For example, the South Korean submarine, which is a new submarine they've made, and they're launching submarine-launched ballistic missiles. So I think the countries of the region are beginning to adapt in different ways to a changed military balance between US and China and the tensions between them. Now, can these be mitigated? My sense is that is what the story of this region is going to be. But in the near term, that the US and its extended deterrence to the region needs to be revamped. And they talk about integrated deterrence is really one part of it. This might involve actually the local countries taking more responsibilities, some burden sharing, some rearrangement of burden sharing, and greater in situ balance of power. These are some of the directions I think the region will move. Whether that is stabilizing, then I would leave it to others to judge.
Could I Jeff, is it okay if I follow that up?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Just to look at this from a different perspective, I agree with what Rajamohan said, but just going back to the wording of the question, in terms of the application of new technologies for military purposes, I think, Bill, that you're probably getting at the impact of cyber, AI, autonomy, hypersonics, space on military capabilities and the distribution of military power in the region. And I think that's a very important point. When many people look at the distribution of military power, they look at it in rather traditional terms, in terms of numbers of combat aircraft, numbers of surface ships, numbers of submarines, aircraft carriers, missiles, main battle tanks, and so on. But it's clear that over the last decade, particularly, there are many new factors in the distribution of military power globally, and particularly in this region. But I think there was an assumption, Bill, in your question that the US and its allies have been caught on the back foot, and that their adversaries are perhaps ahead of them. And I wouldn't assume that. And I think if you look at some of the work that the IISS has done on cyber, for example, recently, it's clear that the US has considerable advantages over its potential adversaries, including China, in the Indo-Pacific region. So the impact of new technologies is going to be terrific. Military force structures throughout the world, including in the Indo-Pacific region, are going to be radically reshaped. That's going on now. But I wouldn't assume that the US and its allies are behind. You look at not only what the US is doing, but what Australia is doing in terms of integrating new technologies. There's a considerable effort underway. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Tim. We have another question this is from John Blacksland, although it sort of follows up on a question that I was thinking about asking. So I'll ask mine first, and that is with regard to the AUKUS agreement, which is, I guess, how we're pronouncing it now. Do the panelists consider the AUKUS agreement an example of action-reaction dynamics? Is this part of ongoing arms racing in the region, or does it threaten to set off an arms race? John's question is for Tim and Brendan: to what extent does AUKUS change the dynamics outlined here? Beyond the initial cool reactions, do you see this acting as a catalyst for the ASEAN most important countries to Australia, notably Indonesia and Malaysia, having a change of heart about sitting on the fence with respect to their engagement with Australia and the other Quad countries?
I might have a first go at that, Jeff, if that's okay, and leave the Southeast Asian dimension to Tim. But John, thanks very much for joining and for your question. I know it's pretty late at night there in Canberra, so I really appreciate you sitting up to listen in today. And indeed, thanks to Bill as well for doing the same. But Jeff, and your question on the action-reaction dynamics, and I think it also goes to John's question as well. I think that that yes, I think that AUKUS is part of that action-reaction dynamic, but it may be an unpopular opinion to offer at the moment, but I'm not sure that it's really the most important part of that action-reaction dynamic. And I wonder, it's interesting, in recent weeks, so much of the commentary has been kind of, maybe I'm thinking about this from an Australian perspective, but there's been so much commentary on AUKUS that I think it's overshadowed some of the more important and potentially more dangerous action-reaction dynamics that are occurring in the region at the moment, and particularly those that are occurring within the Northeast Asian sub-region at the moment. And Raja touched on this when he talked about South Korea's launch of its new submarine, and a few weeks before that, couple of weeks before that, its successful launch of a submarine launched ballistic missile. That kind of action-reaction dynamic between the two Koreas, I think, is an important one to watch. But I think across Northeast Asia more generally, I think, Raja talked about connections between the various subregions. I think that's important as well. I think an interesting parallel that we saw between South Asia and Northeast Asia is just the extent to which less so in Southeast Asia, but the extent to which in Northeast Asia and South Asia, those arms racing dynamics are becoming more complex and more interlinked. As Raja said, the Chinese military modernization is now impacting upon those arms racing dynamics in South Asia. Within Northeast Asia, we're seeing those inter-Korean dynamics, or the arms racing dynamics between China and Taiwan, between Japan and South Korea. It was what Des Ball talked about in his contribution to the book, of doing a complex arms race. And so, I mean, one of the things as we know throughout history, and I think this goes to Bill's question as well, that that when you do get those rapid action-reaction dynamics, and perhaps with the changes in technology that are making those potentially different than previous arms races, and maybe undermining the traditional assumptions about deterrence, or making that deterrence more risky than perhaps it's been in the past. I think that you do get a greater risk of inadvertent escalation, or of what might be called accidental conflict. And I think that that's perhaps why I'm probably putting less weight at the moment on AUKUS, because I think that if you look at some of the shifts in Northeast Asia, we could have I personally think Taiwan's fate will have been decided long before the first Australian nuclear power submarine hits the water in the late 2030s. So I think that, notwithstanding all of the challenges of actually Australia, building, albeit with a lot of assistance from the US and the UK, a nuclear power submarine, I think by the time those boats get in the water, I think a lot of things will have happened between then and now. And as with any action-reaction dynamic, other parties in the region aren't going to be sitting still during that time. It's going to be a much more crowded region in terms of underwater capabilities. China's ASW capabilities, which aren't particularly strong at the moment, will likely have improved a lot by that time as well. So the short answer, I think, Jeff, to your question before handing over to Tim is yes, but I'm not sure that it's as important as some of the other action-reaction dynamics that we see.
Sorry, Tim, you're muted.
Thanks, Brendan. I think I agree with you about that. It's going to take a long time for Australia to bring its nuclear-powered submarines into service, and a lot of other things are happening in the region. And I don't see AUKUS as a significant stimulant for a regional arms race. I see it more as a balancing reaction to developments that are already underway in the region, and as an Australia's part, an effort to catch up in terms of military capabilities, which are in danger of being left behind by regional developments. Turning to John Blacksland's specific question about Indonesia and Malaysia, John, I see what you're getting at, that AUKUS does seem to be is a significant development in the long term, and so I think what you're asking is, will there be a sense in Indonesia and Malaysia that the regional balance is shifting back in favor of the US and its allies, and therefore they might want to bandwagon with the West? I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, you mentioned the initial cool reactions of Indonesia and Malaysia to AUKUS. I think after a while, those reactions will settle down, and there's no choice but to accept this arrangement. They know already that Australia and the US are very close allies. That's nothing new. It was clear before this that the UK wanted to increase its role in Indo-Pacific security. The three are now linked up. Yes, in the long term, Australia is going to have nuclear-powered submarines. But I don't think that this will provide a significant enough reason for Indonesia and Malaysia to abandon very long-held and cherished principles of non-alignment and equidistance and diplomacy based on maneuvering between China and the United States.
Okay, thanks, Tim. We have another question. This is from a PhD student named Faik Khalid. And his question is, in Asia's new geopolitics, what role is traditional diplomacy playing? Is it a constructive, positive role? And how much defense diplomacy is there? And what effects will it have for the future order in Asia? So, Brendan, do you want to have a stab at that?
I was wondering, Lucy, did you want to have a go at that one?
No, this one particularly. I'm happy to go back to the previous question about AUKUS. And it's interesting for me from being a French national that the France has not been mentioned at all in the previous conversation, given the drama that takes place in Paris over over the AUKUS. And I think for me, looking at I think was Jeff's question, is AUKUS part of an action-reaction dynamics? I think we also should take into account what were the original motives for Australia's change of supplier for the submarines, and of course, Brendan, you, being in Australia, you could have more like Australian perspective on this, but the fact that the negotiations were not going so well and the implementation of the contract with the French industrial group, naval group, were sort of questioned in Canberra and elsewhere, might have also played a role here. So in a sense, it's also, I think there's of course the broader strategic motive and the change of threat perception in Australia, but also the economic and industrial dimension of this should also be taken into account. As for the role of diplomacy and defense diplomacy in the region, I think either Lynn or Tim, with their experience on the Shangri-La dialogue, might want to have a say on this.
Okay, yes, before either of you have a stab at that question, we have a related question from a IISS colleague, Antoine Levesque. So his question relates to the future and continued utility of leadership-level diplomacy with China. If, as the authors have underlined, we are looking at a strategic military-led interregnum and prolonged contestation in Asia, with normalization, new institutions, trust building, and crisis management all being harder to do, can top leadership diplomacy, and particularly defense diplomacy, shoulder more of the need to maintain stability? If not, and assuming giving up on leadership defense diplomacy altogether is just not an option, what changes are needed to it, bilaterally as well as regionally? So there's a lot in that question, but Tim, maybe you want to have a...
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Thanks for that question, Antoine. This is a very complex question. I mean, there is a lot of defense diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific region already, and it takes place in a variety of formats, which range from formal interactions with some opportunities for bilateral and multilateral meetings, as we see these in the ASEAN-led processes, particularly the ADMM plus, less formally through the Shangri-La dialogue, and through various other multilateral defense dialogues in the region. There's Xiangshan Forum in China, the Raisina dialogue in India, and a number of others. And I think there's more need for those dialogues between defense ministers, defense chiefs, and the top defense civil servants than there ever has been before. I mean, put simply, the more opportunities there are for fruitful contact, the better. Some formal, some informal, but they're only part of the picture. And I think one thing that this book is arguing for is that in terms of the structure of mechanisms for maintaining regional security, we need to think more broadly and deeply about those mechanisms in terms of confidence building, and perhaps ultimately in the medium to long term, some forms of arms control. So defense diplomacy in itself it is not enough, but it can be a basis for developing practical measures. And that's always been the intention of the IISS Shangri-La dialogue, to provide the opportunity for defense diplomacy at the top level, but not as an end in itself. And over the years, the Shangri-La dialogue, for example, has been used by ministers and military chiefs taking part in it to develop bilateral and multilateral agreements. And I think there is huge potential there. I expect Brendan will be able to add to that.
If I might just respond to this question. I think of the kind of diplomacy that we talk about, multilateral, ASEAN-centered, or the technical discussions on confidence building measures, all that works in normal circumstances. I mean, I think, but today we're talking about big structural changes where major power relations are changing fundamentally. And the fact that the US is willing to end a taboo, if you will, on the transfer of nuclear submarine technology to a close ally, that is one point. And well before that, the rules on MTCR, the Missile Technology Control Regime rules, were relaxed for South Korea. So I think the bigger stuff is happening, and I think we can't simply bank on traditional type of confidence building, arms control, non-proliferation structures. And there I would agree that you need some big traditional classic style diplomacy where some accommodation between the major powers will be required. And even with the minor powers. Well, Trump tried to do a direct summit with Kim. I don't know if it will work. It didn't work. Now again, there is talk about a new summit. So I think we're going to see the need for political innovation, and it is not going to be the classical tools of technical stabilization measures. So those are important, but I think at this point of huge structural change, that the questions are much larger, and I think there we need much more classical diplomacy of the kind we saw a little bit between Putin and Biden in Geneva. I think we will need some accommodation between US and China at the top level, which can then translate into some kind of a specific agreements. But without the top-level political understanding, band-aids of the kind that we're used to, I doubt if that will work in the near future.
Okay, if none of the other panelists want to address the question, I've got another one. This is from Samuel McKinda, who says he hasn't read the book, but he would like to hear more about the three visions. I don't know how much time we want to devote to that, but he also asked an interesting question. Is the West certain that it knows what China wants? Given China's relative inexperience in global power politics, does its leadership know how far it is likely to push its ambitions? Is there sufficient knowledge in the West about how far China can be constrained by the means currently available?
I could maybe talk a little bit about the three visions just briefly, Jeff, and thanks Samuel for your question. Basically, of the three visions, the first one, the free and open Indo-Pacific, is one that is really championed as being kind of pushed most strongly by the US. It's kind of a vision for a US-led kind of order in Asia that also, respects, rules and existing rules and norms. The other countries that are really supporting this most strongly are, Australia and Japan, and I think to some extent India as well. I think the second vision is one that China is really pushing for a kind of a China-centered order that doesn't include the US as part of that equation. And then the third one, I think, is probably the most contentious of the, and this came out in Lynn's remarks. They're really a wonderful set of remarks, Lynn. Thank you for those. And I agree with, a lot of your pessimism about ASEAN, but I do wonder if there is something, there is kind of a third way, or a potential third way that maybe goes beyond ASEAN, and maybe ASEAN is kind of representative of that third way. I'd be interested to hear Tim and Lucy's thoughts on this as well, with the recently released EU vision for the the EU Indo-Pacific strategy. An emphasis there also on inclusivity and not wanting to make choices. I think India to some extent has talked about inclusivity as well. Other countries in the region, particularly the South Koreans and the New Zealanders, are not really wanting to buy into either the US or the Chinese vision. So, I think ultimately countries may be forced to make those choices if we do end up in a big major strategic crisis or conflict. But I do wonder at the moment whether there is maybe the ASEAN outlook is not necessarily the best descriptor or the best exemplar of that particular vision. But I think that there is something else going on there, or potentially there is a third way that countries are grasping it. Samuel, on the second part of your question, do we know what China wants? I think that the short answer to that is no. I think that there are certainly colleagues around the world who are far more expert on China than I am. But even they debate this as to what China's ultimate objectives are. What are the boundaries for that Chinese-led order? Someone like wonderful China expert Nadaj Roland from the National Bureau of Asian Research talks about China wanting to be the dominant power much further, beyond Asia or even the Indo-Pacific, like right into the whole southern hemisphere. Others would say that China wants to be the kind of the dominant power globally. I think there's a lot of debate around these subjects, and it's one of the reasons that kind of makes me worried about. COVID has exacerbated this in a way, but there's been other factors that I think we're having less and less dialogue now with China, and less engagement with China at a time when we really need to be having more of that engagement. It's difficult in the current context. But I think the short answer to your question is no, we don't really, not even the very leading experts in this field can say definitively what China wants.
If I could just jump in here, Jeffrey. Thank you. Thanks, Samuel, for your question. I think your question is a very interesting one, but I would also add to that that it's possible that while there's lack of clarity in terms of what China wants, there's also lack of clarity in terms of what the West wants, right? And whether in fact the West wants the same things. It's often buried under talk of a free and open Indo-Pacific, a rules-based order, etc. But if we look at the U.S. declassified. The document that was declassified in, I think, January this year on strategic guidelines for the Indo-Pacific. I think what we see there is that the U.S. Desire, at least under the Trump administration, was for strategic primacy in the region. So this goes far beyond a rules-based order. It goes far beyond a free and open Indo-Pacific. And I think that ultimately will be what causes the most difficulty in terms of moving ahead with confidence building measures in terms of arms control, etc. Because would China actually knowing or thinking it knows what the US wants, strategic primacy in China's neighborhood, would China actually be willing to go along with measures that makes the world safer, makes the region possibly safer, but also might undermine its strategic advantage vis-a-vis the United States?
Thank you, Lynn. I'd like to ask a follow-on question to this. If we don't know what China wants, can we say that China knows what China wants? Can we say that the West knows what the West wants? In other words, do countries involved in Asian security have overarching consistent grand strategies, or not? And if not, is this lack itself a contributor to instability?
I think it's easy to get very metaphysical about does China know what it wants? Or I think for the rest of the region, you go by what countries do. You don't go by what they think. That if China does things in South China Sea, that has consequences for other states, and they're going to react. If Australia feels that, look, it's being punished unfairly by a stronger power, it needs more deterrence, it's going to turn to somebody. If India feels that China is taking away territory, which in violation of the rules, it is drawing closer to the US. So I think as academics, I think we can tend to get too, esoteric about, grand strategies about countries are responding to pressures of the moment. And the Chinese actions, you could argue, whether they fit into some kind of a pattern and whether there should be collective action dealing with them. But each individual country which feels its position is being undermined by expansion of Chinese power is taking corrective actions. And it is an aggregation of all these will produce outcomes in the region. And some of that we're already seeing. The formation of the Quad, whether Chinese have a grand strategy to dominate Asia or not. Those who worry about Chinese power and its consequences are coming together to deal with the situation.
Thank you. From the very broad and, as you say, metaphysical question to a very specific institutional question, again from John Blaxland, he says Des Ball was instrumental in forming the Council for Security Cooperation in the Asia Pacific as the Cold War was ending. Is that something that we can reinvigorate, or is another mechanism required? Can the Shangri-La dialogue be used as the platform from which to develop this concept further? Tim, maybe you want to have a go at that?
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, John, for that question. I'm not sure if CSCAP is quite the right institution for the times anymore. I mean, that was CSCAP was formed 30 years ago, not long after the end of the Cold War, in a regional environment which was really much more conducive for cooperation, and at that point, it seemed that there was a really significant role for non-government experts in the process. A generation later, the region is much tenser, much more dangerous. The stakes are much higher than they were back then. CSCAP seems to have withered away over time and to have become ineffective. I'm not sure what could be done to restore it, or whether it would really be that useful. I mean, I think I tend to agree with Raja Mohan that this is the stakes are really high. There are major powers involved. The regional situation is dangerous. At one level, there is a need for technical agreements and confidence building measures and potentially arms control arrangements. But as Raja Mohan said, there need to be understandings between the major powers involved in the region to provide a framework for that, a starting point. Now, it may be that non-governmental experts, in some cases, could do some useful work in terms of setting out what might be possible. But I think that this is really going to be up to governments and their foreign policy and defence establishments to work out.
Okay, thank you, Tim. We've got another fairly specific question. This one's from O.D. Meyer. Does the panel think that NATO will have a role to play in Asia?
Well, I don't think neither NATO nor NATO-like institutions are working. And I think what we've seen, the US decision on the one hand to go with the Quad, on the other hand to do AUKUS. Look, I think this region will need a range of flexible coalitions, and we're not going to have a Europe-like single structure of NATO that would take care of that will become the single platform on which security is built. So that's one part, and I think we're already seeing multiple overlapping coalitions that are emerging. Will NATO itself have some role in this part of the world? There is some debate, I think, in Europe. There is, but individually, we've just seen European countries begin to step into the Indo-Pacific debate. Then the French have had this setback, and they're angry at this point. So I think that's an open-ended. I think first the major European powers have to have a common view, and they have to share that understanding with the US before NATO can step in as a serious actor. And I think NATO carries so much of baggage in Asia. I don't see that as becoming a vehicle in the near term as a security actor in this part of the world.
Okay, thank you.
Jeff, can I just add something?
Yeah.
So like to build on what Raja Mohan just said, I think we should remember that some European states do have military assets in the region. So if you look at France, Germany, the UK, they send like regular ships in the region. So it's like maybe not NATO as a whole, as a military actor, it might be difficult to foresee a role for it in a potential conflict outbreak. But it doesn't mean that individual states will not join in with the US in terms of like coalitions. So maybe I wouldn't say that NATO would have a role in a sort of like pure military sense, but it could still have a sort of like political role. And you've seen like the language from NATO communiques against talking about China, having stronger and stronger language in how they address China's rise. And also just to remember that NATO does have partners in the region, Japan, South Korea, and Australia, and I might be forgetting one. So NATO does have some like political role, but for like military role, I think it's difficult to say at the moment.
Okay, thank you. We're only got about 5 minutes left, so I think this might be a good time to sort of sum things up. Brendan, can I hand over to you to sort of draw the discussion together and give us some final comments?
Well, thanks very much, Jeff, and thanks everyone for a very stimulating discussion and for joining us from literally all around the world. I was recently asked to write a review of a review article on the evolution of strategic studies in Australia, and it turned out to be quite an interesting exercise. And I was really struck in writing that review to a much greater extent than I realised about the very close and very long-standing connection of the IISS with Australia. And you know, some of the kind of the giants in the field of strategic studies that I was, you know, looking at, people like Coral Bell, who was, you know, present at the creation of the IISS, Hedley Bull, who was, you know, seemed to spend more time at the IISS than he did in Canberra. Bob O'Neill, of course, who directed the Institute for a number of years, and of course Des Ball, who spent time at the Institute and also published prolifically in the Institute's publications, including the Adelphi series and Survival. But as I went through that, and Tim will be very upset with me, because as I was going through and doing my research, I discovered a bit of history that the IISS wasn't always called the IISS. It was at one point named the slightly more modest ISS. And I think when we look at tonight's event, I think we can see why it was renamed. I think, you know, we've got Jeff joining us from the Isle of Wight. We've got Lucy in Stockholm, Lynn's at the lovely new Berlin office. We've got Raja in Singapore, and Tim in just outside Bangkok in Thailand. And I think it's really, you know, struck me that despite being, you know, entering the second month of a lockdown here in Canberra and thinking about all the horrible things that COVID has caused, this pandemic has caused, it has at least made, you know, sessions like this possible. And it's kind of really been a silver lining of sorts, I suppose, to the pandemic. So, you know, I just wanted to thank Jeff once again for all of your work editing the Adelphi and for chairing today, and also to say a very special thanks to the IISS events team for their always wonderful work that they do putting these sorts of events together. Lynn, thanks to you as always for your absolutely superb remarks. They were thoughtful and insightful as always. Thank you very, very much to my co-authors, to Lucy, to Raja, to Tim, and of course to Des. And last but not least, before handing back to Jeff, just a big thank you to all of you for attending. I hope that you've enjoyed the discussion, and we all very much hope that you'll enjoy reading the book.
I'd like to echo Brendan's thanks to all of you for attending, and I'd personally like to thank all the panelists for coming and for their insights today. I'd also just like to mention my colleagues in the IISS Publications Department, the sub-editors, the designers, everybody whose efforts went into producing this book, which I think you will all enjoy reading. If you are a member, your copy is in the post. If you're not, you can purchase it from a number of sites online. And also just to mention that this session has been recorded, and probably in about 24 hours, I don't know exactly when, it will be up and available on the IISS website. So once again, thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoyed the event today.